the several paces to the tufted, hump-backed sofa where she sat, I cleared my throat. "I hope you're able to attend one of our concerts this summer, Miss Hammond." She, too, had been listening to the goings-on in the hallway, but she took no pains to hide her interest. Seeming to stare right through me to the hall, her blue eyes hardly moved as she replied, "Perhaps I shall. We hear your concerts sometimes in Buttermilk Falls, if the wind is blowing in the right direction." The Hammond son was attempting to play jackstraws, while the youngest sister was begging to join him in the game. Just as the boy had cast the sticks onto the floor, Professor Hammond returned, his wife leaning heavily upon his arm. There was a trace of tears upon her cheeks that any gentleman would know it was best to ignore. And there was a set to the professor's jaw that boded ill for the person who had caused it. As Mrs. Hammond allowed herself to be helped into a chair, I saw exactly who that person was. Professor Hammond was scowling as he gestured to the young woman behind him. "Mr. Westcott, Mr. Conklin, my niece." Of an age with the eldest Miss Hammond and my sister, she was as pretty as a china doll. Prettier even with her hair bunched into curls and her golden-green eyes. Campbell and I bowed at the same moment, as if obeying a martinet's command, while the younger Hammond children left off playing to look on with great interest. Though the smile she offered in return seemed genuine, she clung to her satchel with both hands, the way a cadet clings to a letter from home. "Have you traveled far, Miss Hammond?" Campbell's inquiry was politely subdued, but his interest was plain. "Far enough." Professor Hammond nearly barked the words. Had I been in his classroom, I might have feared for my grade. Campbell retreated a step or two. "Father?" Phoebe rose from the couch, reaching a hand toward him. He crossed to her quickly, tucked her hand under his arm, and led her to her cousin, introducing them. Mrs. Hammond hadn't taken her eyes from her niece since she'd re-entered the room, but the sound of her third daughter sliding dishes across the dining room table seemed to spur her to action. She took the satchel from her niece, setting it in the hall, and then she excused herself and headed for the dining room. While the Miss Hammonds conversed in low tones, Campbell and I pretended not to notice the professor glowering at them. Since it would have been rude to carry on a conversation without him, and since it was plain that he was in no mood to speak, we resorted to tricks learned during 3 years' worth of parades. I raised a brow. Campbell responded by pointing to the collar of his gray coat. I adjusted the black stock that sat beneath the collar of my own coat. He nodded and raised a brow at me. I put a hand to the red silk sash that was tied about my waist and extended a finger down toward the fringed ends that spilled past the thigh of my white cotton trousers. He raked his fingers through the ends of his sash, untangling them. Professor Hammond was still glowering, so I turned my attention to the room. Number of dainties and dust catchers on the mantel? 7. Number of chairs? 3. In tufted green velvet, gently worn. Sofa? 1, also in velvet. Pictures on the wall? 2. Indistinct, vague drawings of rural landscapes. Mirrors? 1. With a carved round frame reflecting the simple, homey appeal of the room. Ways of ingress? 2. Through the hall and the dining room. Of egress, counting the windows when necessary? 5. I smiled at Campbell. He smiled at me. It was a great relief when we were called to the dining room. As we approached the table, I gave Millie, the middle daughter, a wink. She wrinkled her nose at me in return. Millie always put me in mind of my sister. Though younger by several years, she had that same restless, spirited nature. Generally, when we were given passes to come to supper, Mr. Hammond escorted his eldest daughter to the table, and I escorted Mrs. Hammond. I would have expected Mr. Hammond to have escorted his niece that evening as an honored guest. Apparently she did too, for when he took up his daughter's arm instead, the niece's step faltered. I caught Campbell's eye, nodded toward Mrs. Hammond, and offered my arm to the niece. "Miss Hammond?"